Okay, today I wanted to talk about perception, judgment, and error. I'm going to try to make this not very much a case of death by PowerPoint, but primarily want to discuss what the acts of the mind are, where error occurs, and exactly what perception is. Some people say they had an error of the senses, or their eyes erred. We're going to kind of look at if that could be the case or not. And we'll kind of see how all of the acts of the mind and perception relate to each other or not. So looking at what we're going to be looking at as far as definitions and meanings go, we're going to look at what perception is, understand error, understand at least basically the three acts of the mind, and then we'll look at where perception would occur with these, and then whether we can really say that we can have an error of perception. So there are a lot of different definitions as to what perception means. Very simply here, you have like an internal perception and an external perception, according to the many definitions. So one can just be from the senses, and the other one is about one's own body, as we can see there. But moving ahead, going back here again to the contemporary psychology and epistemology, we see more of they're talking about the ordinary sense. So this is a huge question, though, as to what we mean by perception, and we want to keep these in mind as we go ahead here. So when we start talking about error, Father Hardin describes error as a positive disagreement between mind and the object. So essentially, the mind thinks the object is something other than as the object itself is. So truth usually is defined as the conformity of mind to reality. So if the object is really this, the mind has truth when it perceives that object as it is. So, well, that's what error is. This becomes real important when we start discussing the acts of the mind, because this is where we are able to err in our process of thinking. So we have understanding or simple apprehension, and this is just the basic concepts of things. So moon, there's an idea behind moon. It's up in the sky. It gives light at night, reflects from the sun. So there's all these ideas behind what we mean by moon, and moon itself is an idea. Usually that's called a term or a concept. It's very, very important that they're clear and not ambiguous. We understand what reality means by our concepts. And concepts are spiritual, abstract, universal, require relations, and are unchanging. So we have these ideas in our mind of what moon is, etc., so forth, or sun, or stars, a rock. So very, very simple, understanding things as they are. The second act of the mind is judgments, and these relate only to prepositions. So usually what you see is that some or all of this thing is that thing. So you're kind of making an assertion or a denial. Maybe it's not that thing. And this only relates to true and false. We'll never have a case of where we're discussing true or false in understanding or simple apprehension, and nor in the next one, reasoning. Judgments relate only to true and false, and they're always expressed in a proposition. Usually these are declarative sentences, almost all the time declarative sentences. And then finally, reasoning/conclusions or arguments, where we would say, if all A is B and all B is C, then we could also say that all A is C. So this is more about a logical progression of thinking on how things relate to each other. So I don't want to sit too much on these acts of the mind, but it's very important that when we're talking about simple apprehension or understanding, we are just talking about clarity. And when we're talking about judgments, we're talking about true and false. And when we're talking about reasoning, we are talking about logically valid. So when we start talking about perception and error here, we see perception is information about one's environment, information about one's own body, external senses, and some theories hold internal power. This is an internal related power, and some hold an external sense power. And error is a disagreement between mind and object, which relates only to judgments, is found in what the mind conceives. And there's also the notion of a mistake in correctness or validity in reasoning. This is less often and usually more used in a general sense, not in a philosophical sense. So the first question that I think we need to kind of answer is perception internal or external? And there's some philosophers have held perception as all external. There's others that have held perception to be completely internal. Sense datum is one of these more prevalent theories around, and there's a lot of variations to it. But very simply, if you look at the summary, it's a kind of thing we are directly aware of in perception, but are dependent upon the mind. And if they're dependent upon the mind, we end up with kind of like this question of, well, if they're dependent upon the mind, then does the mind come first or does the object come first? And also have the properties that perceptually appear to us, so we can perceive them. So Gallagher says this is a fluid situation, and there's not a whole lot of answers to it, but he concludes perceptual consciousness is never purely subjectivity. Perceptual consciousness never stands alone. Perceptual data always exist just exactly where they are experienced as existing. And perceptual consciousness seems to put us in contact with a multiplicity of non-selves. So this is kind of going back to this universal type ideas that we receive through perception, and we can have some abstract thoughts as well. So Gallagher says those are pretty much the main things that we can know as far as perception goes. So can perception err? Well, if perception is solely to be said of the senses, an external act or a receiving of external things, it can really not be said to err. If it is internal, then it must occur in the second act of the mind, which is the judgment, and that is because the judgment relates to true or false, and it's really only in true or false that we can be said to err. So we're going to follow through a couple quick examples of how we can or cannot see where this would occur. So perception as external. So now we're talking about looking with the eyes. So we have a healthy set of eyes. They observes an object moving towards him in the fog. Can't discern what the object is. Would we say that because we cannot see the object that there's an error? At this point, we'd say no. The eye is observing its environment properly. You can't see clearly through the fog, so you can't see the object moving in the fog. And that's because there's this medium of fog blocking the vision. But the eye would still be said to be working correctly. And now the exact same situation. Let's go again. The eye observing a moving object, and the person who's looking at this makes the judgment that it must be his dog. So let's say he's looking for his dog in the fog. Here an error could exist or not exist depending on whether or not his judgment is correct. Is it really his dog? If it is his dog, then his judgment would be correct, but if it's not his dog, he would be said to be in error. So this depends on, somewhat circumstantially here, whether or not his judgment, the thought in his mind, is correct. So if we go right again, this time in the fog, same eyes. We would say, let's say, further investigation, the object is found to be a rock. Obviously not moving, but it appeared to be moving to the eyes. Now, at this point, would we say that perception has erred? And once again, it seems not, because the eye observed what appeared to be moving. This would not be a error in the eye, because the eye doesn't make a judgment. The mind makes the judgment. And in this sense, we would be saying that the eye was maybe misled or deceived by the medium of fog. But we wouldn't really say that the eye has made an error. As I said, in general conversation in the world, a lot of people would say, well, there was an error. But technically, in the philosophical sense, we wouldn't really say that was an error, but more of a mistake or a deception. So, as external, it really can never be said to error. Perception, the senses just receive what's presented to them. The organs have to be healthy, normal organs. Some people are colorblind, and that we wouldn't expect them to see color the same as a healthy eye. And the other thing is perception, like in the fog case, the perception doesn't always observe things as they truly exist. Different mediums, injured organs. So when we move to external, we got to talk about sense datum real quick here. We're talking about things we're directly aware of in perception. They're dependent on the mind and have properties that perceptually appear to us. So the first thing we actually have to figure out here is things which are directly we're aware of in perception could apply to both internal and external perception. So that's one thing we want to keep in mind as we progress here. And the next thing, being dependent on the mind is internal alone. Subsequently, here we go, I'm doing death by PowerPoint. Based on our previous scenario, the fog is dependent on the mind. Everything in that scenario is dependent upon the mind. The object is dependent on the mind, etc. This is following the sense datum. It's not subjectivity, but it's saying the mind is necessary for the perception. And this is also how sense datum allows for dreams, or would explain dreams and hallucinations and such things, which do not come through the senses. And then finally, the properties that perceptually appear to us, this is kind of returning back to the external ability. And this is kind of Hume's theory here, which sets it up pretty simply. The thing which we are directly aware of appears to change. Like he says, size or change. The real external object does not change. So when we say we could have an error here or a mistake, therefore the thing we are directly aware of is not the real external object. So once again, are we talking error here, or are we talking mistake of the senses? This is where we kind of get into some quagmire. The phenomenon of perspective variation, the thing we are directly aware of, changes. The real external object does not change. Therefore, we're not aware of the object as it is. Again, we would say this would be misled or deceived senses, but not erring, because they're not saying truth or false. That would be the act of the mind. But as internal, it's very difficult to say whether or not this is an act of judgment or an act of just the perception, because it depends on which process the person is in their thinking or in their perception of the actual object. So this is just kind of a summary of what we just said. So if the mind perceives an external object to be other than that as really exists, can it be said to err? So as we were just saying, it's not an error if it's in the first act of the mind. That really wouldn't be correct to say. We would have to say it could be an error of judgment if there's a judgment that's actually made. At that point, we're talking back to truth. So perception could possibly be a problem of understanding, and greater clarity could resolve this error. So having clear ideas, as we said at the first act of the mind, clear ideas, clear understanding, clear concepts, clear terms, is a huge thing. And once again, if perception is part of the second act of the mind, of the judgment, and we could definitely say that perception could err in that particular case. But it would have to be judged to be true or false, which would determine whether or not it was correct. St. Thomas in the Summa, so going to the Perennial Philosophies here, he quotes right out of the Summa, everyone who is deceived does not really understand that wherein he is deceived. And the philosopher says the intellect is always true. So we would get the impression there, historically, the perennial philosophies, that the perception cannot really err in the sense that we'd be speaking of here. So some say this is a problem of language, and that can definitely be the case to some degree, because we have a lot of different meanings of what perception entails and how broadly it affects the senses and the powers of the mind and so forth. A lot of different definitions, a lot of reading that could go in just to studying perception to get a clearer idea. So with perennial philosophy, the sense datum theory appears to require a much clearer explanation of how it progresses and how perception is involved in the acts of the mind. And as Gallagher states, perception should be prior to any acts of the mind. So this is kind of more on the perennial side of things. Perception is even before understanding, as we'd understand it in the perennial philosophy side. And in the sense datum side, it's not really clear exactly where perception would take place. The senses should always be working together to avoid a mistake of perception, so you should use as many organs as possible to ensure accuracy. And again, the improper medium can definitely deceive the senses and to receive incorrect data. These are the sources I used to get much of the information that you see here. If you have any questions, definitely give a shot to the blog. I will add a page here for that. And definitely feel free to put a link up to the blog. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if you have any disagreements, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation as far as those go. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch this.